I'm going to move this on you. I hope you don't mind. All right. Good afternoon, brethren and guests. I always say brethren, and we got plenty of other people here. So, love to see the faces out here in the crowd. It's excellent. Before I introduce our next speaker, I did just want to remind folks, too, we are live streaming the broadcast today, and after each one, these are being posted out to Facebook. So if you missed a session today, if there was something you wanted to go back to, if there was a piece of information that you wanted to catch on one of the speakers, you can always go back and watch them out on Facebook after the fact. They're all being posted basically once the speakers are done. So you don't have to worry about missing out on something. All right, so our next speaker, Dr. Craig Williams, is going to talk about the metaphysics of Kshatriya, masculinity, and the spiritual warrior in contemporary times. So, Dr. Williams is a practitioner of Ayurvedic medicine, Vedic sciences, Gnostic spirituality, and martial arts. Craig Williams is also the author of Cave of the Numinous, Tantric Physics Volume 1, as well as numerous articles on health, martial arts, and authentic initiation in the Kali Yuga. Craig also writes various daily meditation pieces in his blog, Transmissions from the Kali Yuga, which is available, and I'm going to butcher this, but out on arisearjuna.wordpress.com. And if anybody wants to, just Google Craig Williams. I'm not giving you that one again, or the spelling. Craig Williams is an ordained bishop, Tau Lazarus, with apostolic succession with the Ecclesia Gnostica Aeterna. Craig has a private medical practice in Austin specializing in traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, yoga, and Jyotish. He is the recipient of the prestigious Veda Kovid and Yogacharya titles awarded by Vamadeva Shastri and the American Institute of Vedic Studies. More information can be found at www.ayurvedaaustin.com. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. Craig Williams has extensive training and education, a sincere dedication to practice and study, and an ability to distill complex philosophies and practices into accessible and practical wisdom for modern spiritual aspirants. A rising star in the world of esotericism, I highly recommend Craig's writings and teachings. From Greg Kaminsky, host, founder of the Cult of Personality, and a brother and one who many here know. I have found Craig to be uniquely qualified and adept not only at Ayurvedic medicine, but in Vedic astrology, classic yoga, I almost said Yoda, Vedic sciences, Vedanta, Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and clinical herbalism as well. It is a rare combination that makes his work very special, as well as extremely practical. Craig can diagnose and treat imbalances with Ayurveda or Chinese medicine, adding a proficiency of clinical herbalism to his treatment that has little parallel among Ayurvedic practitioners in the West. He can examine Vedic astrology charts relative to health and clarity and precision, and recommend yoga and meditation practices in depth for physical, psychological, or spiritual purposes. From David Foley, Vamadeva Shastri, American Institute of Vedic Studies. All right, this one's my favorite. Unlike many modern-day Vedic prophets, he is no superficial American who wishes to express or superimpose pasteurized or New Age pseudo-Vedic wisdom upon the world. That's by just a quick, I love that. His refreshing wisdom reflects that of great lion-hearted rishis from Vishwamitra and this is the tough one, Vasishtha in ancient times to Shankaracharya, Dayananda, Vivekananda, Ayurveda, and Aurobindo in more recent times, who are echoed in his wise words and personality. From Rodney Lingham, Veda Kovid, author Agni Rahasya, The Secret of Celestial Fire in Yoga and Ayurveda. His published works include Cave of the Numinous, Tantric Physics Volume 1, Entering the Desert, and Cult of Golgotha. With that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Craig Williams. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you for being so patient with all the Sanskrit. I promise I won't have that much in my talk today. So I think, first of all, I'd like to say it's an honor to be here to speak at Ezekiel Bates Lodge. I spoke here in the past. It's an amazing organization and a very powerful environment. And I'm very passionate about our relationship to the environment. And there are certain magical spaces. We'll talk about some of that today. So even this room, this whole atmosphere is very conducive to these talks. So it's an honor to be here. I don't want to go into a lot of Sanskrit verbiage, but I will quickly give a definition of the word Kshatriya, because some of you might not be aware of that. And the title of the topic today was The Metaphysics of the Kshatriya, Masculinity and the Spiritual Warrior in Contemporary Times. Kshatriya, the word itself, is a Sanskrit word which means rule or authority. And it comes from the idea of there was 4 classes of social structure. They would have the Brahmins, which were the priest, the Kshatriyas, which were sometimes called the warrior class, the Vaishyas, which were the merchants, and the Shudras, which were the caste of people who weren't involved in those structural aspects of society. So over time, that word has come to be seen as some type of warrior class, a class that was defending society, a class that we would typically say in India that was defending Dharma. Dharma Rakshasa, that's the name that was given to me in India, which means defender of the Dharma. And that was because some of my ideas will be present today. So the idea of the modern Kshatriya, the modern man, means someone who defends Dharma, defends the role of masculinity in society and what that means. This is a short amount of time. I usually have about 2 or 3 hours to talk. Today I have about 45 minutes or so, and I want to leave enough time for questions. So I'm going to try to cram a lot of stuff into a small space. So hopefully I'll do that. I think the main thing that I want to cover today is the concept of the embodiment, the physical embodiment of the initiatic experience. That's something which should be on everyone's mind, particularly in a Masonic structure, because everything is based on initiation, right? We talk about that a lot. What does initiation mean? And we talk about areas of our lives, often refer to them as fields. From the Bhagavad Gita, for example, I'll read a verse here in a second which explains what the Kshatriya is according to that. The Bhagavad Gita is a sacred scripture in India which happens on a battlefield, Kurukshetra, the battlefield. And so oftentimes you hear these metaphors. The teachings of the Bhagavad Gita is related to the battlefield of life. So we have a lot of fields in our life. We have a field of physicality, we have a field of our mental life, and we have a field of our spiritual life. And those are the 3 areas which I'm going to kind of go through today and discuss. Really quickly, I will read from the Bhagavad Gita, which is chapter 18, verse 43. And this is the Sanskrit translation directly from Sanskrit. And this gives what their technical definition of what the Kshatriya is. And hopefully this will kind of give you an idea. And it says, heroism, power, determination, resourcefulness, courage in battle, generosity, and strong leadership are the qualities of the Kshatriyas. So that's these ideas of heroism, power, determination, resourcefulness in battle, whatever battle that may be, generosity and leadership. These are very important topics when we discuss masculinity. Last week, for example, I saw a recent study on the struggle of the military to get weight under control for their cadets. And wrap your mind around that for a second. And that means they're having trouble not only finding people that are in shape enough to actually get into boot camp, but actually stay in shape enough to get to boot camp. And this is a very modern problem. And so that shows a lot of problems we have on the physical structure. And so that's kind of what I want to lead into. Is typically we think about fields of expression of initiation, right? We think about a physical initiation. That's something which our culture is losing at a rapid pace. We can see that people are, in many ways, they're trying to find pseudo-initiations. Maybe you are familiar with, say, the works of René Guénon, the writer of traditionalism, and he would even use a very powerful term, which I often use in my esoteric writings, and that was counter-initiation. A pseudo-initiation, a fake initiation, which someone thinks they're getting a real initiation, but they're getting sold something fake. An easy way to wrap your mind around this would be, let's say you're a member of a martial arts school, and they just give you belts because you pay for them. We see that a lot, right? And so someone says, well, I'm a black belt. I've gone here for a certain amount of time. I've paid my money. And then they'll give them a black belt. And then can they in reality defend themselves? And well, hopefully then they'll never have to test that, right? Oftentimes they do test it, and then they find out they don't know what they thought they did. They might have the belt, they might have the t-shirt, but they don't have the talent. We see that, of course, happening in academic structure as well, too. We can see that it's a modern problem with that. But one concept that is coming up time and time again today is this concept of the threat of masculinity, right? That's a modern concept. We see that now. Often the term toxic masculinity is used. And the future is female, has nothing to do with men. It's a very big thing that's happening right now. And I think we have to look at these topics, discuss them intelligently, and particularly, I think, from a Masonic perspective, because Masons are seen, obviously, as a male-structured organization and should embody these. I keep going back to that word embody, and that's something I want to talk about on the fundamental level today. Is when I mean embody, I mean physically embody that. And I think when we talk about initiations, we talk about initiations happening in fields of experience at a physical level, at a mental level, at a spiritual level. I think as a society, what's happening now, and particularly from spiritual groups and spiritual structures, is we're skipping through the physical and we're jumping straight to the mental and then straight to a pseudo-spiritual. And so why is that happening? Why is the physical part being ignored? And I would go so far as to say it's not even being ignored, it's being demonized. And we call that fitness shaming right now, right? If someone is in shape, then they make other people uncomfortable. We can see that going on. So I think one thing we need to talk about first when we talk about modern masculinity is the responsibility we have to take care of the physical body. It's a key thing we're ignoring. We see that culturally. For example, as a medical practitioner, a big modern concern today, there's three big ones we see. One is the growing rates of diabetes. That's huge. It's if you saw the numbers predicted to, let's say, like 2040, it would sound like something out of The Walking Dead. What we're going to see coming. It's very dangerous. That's a big concern. That's obviously, we're talking about also, when I say that quickly, it's type 2 diabetes. Diabetes that you acquired, not that you were born with. This typically is acquired most often as a result of diet and lifestyle. Number 2 is obesity. That obviously is going hand in hand. We're seeing skyrocketing rates of obesity, both in children and adults both. That's also not getting worse. Regardless of how many movies we have out now, Super Size Me, Food Matters, we have such an amazing exposure to information now that people are not doing anything with it. So that's happening. And then the third one, which is a big concern, is the dramatically plummeting levels of testosterone. That's scientifically proven. That's not an opinion. That's not my opinion from Ayurvedic medicine or esoteric studies. That's what we say, science. That's him. And so those are big concerns for masculinity in modern age. What does that mean? And so that's something I wanted to touch on. So if you wanted to concern yourself with what can I do to make myself the strongest representation of a male from a spiritual perspective, we can look at that, carrying dharma, defending dharma, having courage, heroism. We can't ignore the health of the physical body. If you want to see what would be the way I can be the strongest male psychologically that I can be, we can't ignore the role of the physical body. It's a fundamental thing, and that's something which everyone seems to be jumping over now. Organizations jump over this. I see this all through occult worlds and everything. For example, there was a funny article that I saw recently, and I believe it was Utney Reader, might have been The Nation, and it was an article that said the fat president. It was a big article, and it was kind of like lambashing. But I find that very ironic because it was not just a fat president, it's a fat nation. If we look at the statistics, everyone was that too. So that kind of, I was thinking about that when I was thinking about why is that? Why are we continuing to ignore that? And also demonizing it. So from where I come from, the perspective of esoteric study from traditions from India, and as a teacher of martial arts, integrating the philosophy of martial arts through a lifestyle, the physical body becomes the foundation from which everything springs from. There had to be a health and vitality with that. Whether in India they may have had a physical practice of yoga, or we had the science of Ayurveda, which means the science of life, so they were looking at diet and lifestyle. And so I think as a male, when we look at the concerns we have today with plummeting testosterone levels, raising heart disease, obesity, the role of the physical body becomes literally your field of expression of your spirituality. It becomes the field which you can grow stronger in your studies. And it's very easy for us to just kind of skip that and go straight to learning the words in a book, or saying you're going to deeply study a spiritual practice while ignoring the physical. So I think on a fundamental level, what we have to touch upon is the role of the physical. And I like to talk about that. I say the physical body, the flesh, should be a sacrament. We talk about it, and probably as a Masonic lodge, you're familiar with Christian mysticism terms, the idea of the sacraments, the body and blood. There needs to be some factor in your life where you're starting to see the field of your physical body as a spiritual sphere. And what does that mean? That can mean something different for everyone. Obviously, on a fundamental level, for me, as a lifetime practitioner of martial arts, I can find nothing better in my mind that sums up than martial arts. Obviously, right? So I encourage all children to get involved with martial arts. We have a saying, and they'll say martial arts or kung fu curing ADD since 1600 AD or something like that. And they'll have a picture of a young child, balancing on his finger and with 2 bowls of rice on his hand, focusing. But I think those are really important teachings. The idea of if seeking out some kind of practice of the physical body is very important. That also is a reason it becomes daunting to people. People they can look and say, well, you're already naturally athletic. I can't do that. Or I'm too old to do that, or I'm too young to do that. I would compare that to saying that I'm too old or too young or too this to join a Masonic lodge. I don't think too many people says that. So everyone can start somewhere about where they are in the physicality of transforming the physical body into a sacred space. Whether you choose to have a lifetime of deep study of Wing Chun, Kung Fu like I do and teach that, or whether you just start walking more each day. It's the same level. We have a spectrum of that. So I always tell everyone when they're studying esoteric studies, they can't ignore the physical. And every great esoteric teacher always had some deep aspect of their life where they were cultivating something in a physical practice. So I think on a fundamental level, number one, if we want to address the challenge of masculinity in modern times, first of all, it has to be physical health. There's no way around that. You have to be around for your family. You have to be around for your children or your friends or your lodge. For example, a Masonic lodge is only as strong as each individual member is. And if each individual member has a lot of health problems, that's very challenging for everyone on every level. So that's number one thing. I would say number one, there has to be an addressing of the health of the physical body. What that means for you, that can be quite different. It can be everything. For example, in my clinical practice, I'm a huge proponent of Tai Chi. I recommend Tai Chi to everyone because anyone and everyone can do Tai Chi. It can transform the body. I'm much more of a fan of Tai Chi than I am of yoga, per se, which a lot of people find funny is my background in India. But that's something which is very hard for a lot of people to do. A lot of people can't wrap their mind around the idea of yoga. They think it's too religious or something that. So that's another thing. Obviously, walking, running, weightlifting, those things are very important. As a medical practitioner, I will say one thing, which is a very important thing as we address the field of physicality, is the most common things that happen to men as they age is they lose muscle. So we tend to, as you see your muscles go away, you'll see your testosterone levels drop. And so one of the key things I always encourage everyone to do is find some type of training that is involved with building muscle. That can be something as simple as doing push-ups at home or literally sitting in a chair and lifting books over your head. That's one of the reasons why we see lower rates of osteoporosis in gardeners. And the gardeners are, number one, obviously they're out in the sun all the time. They're getting more vitamin D, but they're also lifting. They're carrying bags of mulch. They're moving things around. There has to be some kind of physical practice. And so when we address the idea of the modern spiritual warrior, we can't ignore the physical, and we have to see what is it that is causing this kind of age-related decline in testosterone? What is it causing more and more people to get diabetes? What is it that's causing that? There's a lot of factors involved, but on the fundamental level, the health of the physical body is huge with that. That's why often for many people who can't run a lot, they can't do martial arts a lot, I'll recommend them do some type of practice where they're building their muscles. In many ways, for many men, since we're talking about masculinity, the building up of the muscles is actually more important than cardio, vascular exercise. For me, Everyone who knows me or follows me knows I'm a devoted long-distance runner. I love that. I love to do MMA and fighting, so I do kind of all of that. But that's my own passion. I don't encourage everyone to do that. But I think on a fundamental level, there has to be some physical activity. You have to examine your physical sphere. You have to examine the physical sphere of your life. Is there any kind of activity happening in there? Why or why not? That has to come into play. So that's your field of experience. Telling you about the muscles, this little pearl for you to get in there as well too. After we leave the physical, we look at the mental. That's the mental sphere of masculinity. What does that mean? That's a big idea with there. You'll often notice that I have a yin and yang aspect to these things. That influences my practice of Chinese medicine. Every field we have has in it a soft aspect and a hard aspect. And so there has to be a balance with that in there too. For example, with martial arts, many people who run a studio or teachers know some of the most annoying students they have are the best fighters. And so, often in the Chinese, they'll say, you're cursed and blessed if you have a school of very good fighters. Because usually that means someone is hot-headed. They might be physically strong, but they're not that smart. The jock idea, right? And so the physical part also needs to have a soft aspect where the physical training is also teaching you patience. What does that mean? That means as you grow and transform your physical body, that's what we talked about. It's an alchemical transformation. You're starting to learn discipline. You're starting to learn goals. You're starting to learn patience. So the pursuit of physical health has a lot of fruits that has to do with just you're going to have better health, but you're also going to learn patience, dedication, devotion, focus. All the things our modern culture says we don't have anymore, that everyone's suffering from ADD or I can't focus. Also, too, and a final thing, we know that physical fitness dramatically boosts mood. And now, finally, just in this past year, the American Medical Association is going to bring back in the recommendation or prescription of exercise for depression. It's truly is a medicine. Doesn't mean that it cures it, but it means it plays a large role in what's going on with that. So all that's happening, then you start to hear that, you're thinking, well, we're taking the physical and it's starting to seep into the mental now. There's not such a clear-cut thing. I can stand up here and go, number 1, physical, number 2, mental, number 3, spiritual, and it's very convenient to draw those on a board, but they're constantly integrating. They're constantly kind of interweaving back and forth in a symbiosis. So as the physical body becomes stronger and become healthier, you'll often see dramatic psychological changes, psychological improvements. That moves us into that field. What does it mean for masculinity and being psychologically or mentally strong or healthy? For me, that means constant education. One of the most disturbing trends I see in modern times, and this is not necessarily exclusive to masculinity, but is the lack of reading. We see that happening at a dramatic pace now, so much so that when you look on the internet now, the articles that you'll typically click on are required to have a reading time on the top. And they're doing that because they're hoping that they can get it as short as possible because they know that when people click and it says, Craig's written an article and it's a 12-minute read, Bob's written an article, it's a 3-minute read, Bob's really cool. We're going to go right there. People don't have time in their mind to read anymore, so that's what's happening. It's starting to form something which we call the shallows. It means the information pool is getting shallower and shallower and shallower, particularly from technology-based internet searching, typically. So when I often address this, I often say the physical aspect, of course, is going to bleed into the psychological, the mental, but the mental has to be just as strong, and that means you have to dive just as deep mentally as you would physically. So what does that mean? Well, that means examining for, obviously, number 1, how much are you reading? What are you reading? That means, are you just on your iPhone all day reading articles that are only 3 or 4 minutes long? That typically creates a certain mind space or attention span that can only last 3 or 4 minutes long. Or are you reading longer pieces of things? So another troubling trend that ties in with that is what we call, you'll see that in what they call the Common Core curriculums now. And one of my undergraduate degrees before I went into medicine was literature. And so I've read a lot. I write a lot. I'm a writer. And so you'll see now what people used to read entire books. Now they're just reading excerpts, right? People don't have to read the whole Shakespeare book anymore. Just read an excerpt. People don't have to read the whole Faulkner book anymore. It's confusing and it's weird. Just read an excerpt from that. So that's on paper, that sounds great, but then they're losing the whole perspective. They're losing the whole perspective. That's a good analogy. That's like martial arts, just teaching you how to punch, but they're not teaching you the philosophy. It's a whole thing with that. So number one, examine what you're consuming mentally. What are you reading? The quality of that. Is it challenging you? Is it making you stronger? If not, then that's something you should look at it just as much as exercise. You should look at that, what's going on with that as well too. And I recommend everyone to take a journal of these ideas. I do that with all my patients. I recommend, what are you reading? We look at your diet constantly. We look at a diet journal. I'll have someone bring in, I need to see your food diary for a month. We can metabolically look and see what's going on. Why are you suffering from high triglycerides? Maybe your testosterone levels are low. What are you eating? But also if someone comes in and says, I'm depressed, I can't focus, I'm bored, well, I say, what's your reading diary? We have to look at it and say, what are you reading? What are you studying? And then what are you digesting mentally? And so that's a big aspect to bring in. So we can't ignore that. And I think as a society, it's not being challenged. It's not being pushed anymore. Reading groups are dropping, often so that's something I encourage everyone to examine is you have to examine what are you approaching on the physical body, but also what are you approaching on the mental body? How deep are you diving with that? That brings up the idea of digestion. It's a big thing. It's like, how much can you do psychologically? So a lot of people, we see this a lot. I call them, book collectors. And people they'll order the book, they'll buy the book, and they've got a great library, but you can't talk about the books with them. You can't discuss the books with them. One of my favorite things to do is to get into really deep discussions about books. And I'll be, oh, have you read this book? And you want to talk to them. They're like, oh, no, I have it, but I didn't read it. And so that's that kind of trap that's happening now because we have such ease and access. I downloaded the book. I bought the book. So examine that, see that, and see like, okay, am I actually reading the material? Am I spending enough time? And often by doing that, it starts to reveal imbalances in your life. If you say, what's my exercises for the week? And people say, I don't have time to exercise. That's usually a sign of a larger problem. And if you bump it down to the next level and say, well, Craig asked me to look at my reading for the week and how much am I reading? You say, well, I don't have time to read. And you say, okay, that might be another problem. What's going with there too? How crammed is my schedule? Do I have breathing space to actually grow as a man? Do I have breathing space to actually pursue an alchemical spiritual path? Those are very important questions to ask. We have to look at the physical alchemy of changing your body physically from the inside out. Do you have the time to do that, and why not? Do you have the time to dive in, read quality books, and discuss them with friends? Why or why not? What's the time with that? That's something that everyone needs to do. Then we look at the third level, the field of experience, which has that kind of nebulous term, spiritual, right? What does that even mean anymore? To me, that's something which often is ignored too. Sometimes we'll get caught in the middle, right? People ignore the physical. They kind of ignore the spiritual. They just kind of exist in this strange kind of nebulous mental world of just discussions, endless discussions that never really take them anywhere. So from my experience of deep esoteric studies in India, Tibet, French, Haitian spiritual experiences are very intense experiences which we would definitely term Gnostic. And I was very happy to see the talk about the divine architect because that showed you these artists and these scholars that were teachers and scholars that had all these informations, all this information streams which were feeding into their lives. And you can see we do not have that anymore for the most part. And that's why these people, we say, how could someone do that when they were 29 years old? Because they were doing a lot less of stuff that we were doing, and they were doing a lot more of stuff that we're not doing. And so we have to look at, there was nothing special back then about them necessarily. Many things, they didn't have the things we had now, right? We should be able to, in theory, do more, but we're not in some of those levels. So that's something to look at is how much time am I wasting that I don't have time to exercise? How much time am I wasting that I don't have time to learn psychologically the level I want? And then we move into the spiritual, the Gnostic example. That means a personal spiritual experience. So just as the word spiritual gets thrown around, the word Gnostic gets thrown around. What does that really mean? One of my degrees was in religious studies. I focused on Gnosticism. That's not the time and the place to go into a 4-hour lecture on that. But essentially what you need to remember is Gnosticism means a personal experience of what I would refer to the numinous, the divine. That's what has to be happening. Spiritual doesn't necessarily mean, from this perspective, reading the Bible. For example, we know anyone could read the Bible. Reading a sacred text, someone could read a sacred text and do very horrible things. We can see that happen historically. So what that means spiritually is, do you have some relationship to something in your life that is a spiritual teaching that is giving you a personal taste of something beyond what you can conceive? Are you having some type of practice in your life which you're getting to what Ramana Maharshi from India would say, repeated dips in the ocean of the heart? I love that phrase. And it's like you just could dip into the ocean and then you come back out. He would often say it's very hard to stay into that ocean for a long time, but you can take periodic dips. And you should come back and be very refreshed from that. So that's something to think about too, is I think that mental sphere is very important, that we have to learn and grow psychologically, intellectually, but we also have to have some spiritual path in our life, which is a true alchemical path, in the sense that is the words we're reading, the ideas we're bringing in, are giving us keys to an inner experience. And that's what Gnosticism truly means. That means you could read these sacred texts and you're having some initiation, but it's changing who you are. One thing you could see about this that you can almost say, like, well, how can I test this? How can you prove this is happening on these different fields of experience? I talked about digestion earlier. That's a big thing to think about, is like for the spiritual experiences, like usually what I mean by that would be if someone was studying some type of spiritual subject, over time they start to see life differently. I refer to that in one of my recent books, Entering the Desert, as the sacramental vision. And what that means is through these spiritual experiences, we literally start to see life differently. We literally see things differently. Like the bread and the wine is no longer bread and wine. It's sacrament up. Someone else gets walk up and say, that's just bread and wine. But to the Gnostic priest or to someone who partake in that, it's like, no, that's something way more that's there. It's the same thing we see maybe going to a nature, for example. That's a big thing that we're lacking right now, is a connection to nature. We see that. For example, what culture is overworking themselves to death? Japan. And they know it. So now what's their prescription? Forest bathing. Every executive or everyone says you have to go to the forest and sit in the forest for 30 minutes a day. And they're very logical and systematic about it, right? And they'll say, then they have the studies and say this amount of time drop the cortisol levels, this amount of time drop stress hormones, this amount of time hormones were balancing, because people were reconnecting with nature. But they were also having their own personal experience in nature with that. And they would go back to work from their dip into the ocean of the heart or dip into the forest, and they were better, they felt better, they were more productive physically and mentally. Spiritual practice should be that too. Your spiritual practice should be some source of nourishment in your life, which no matter what happens in your life, gives you some sense of solace. Because we all have our own individual karma, right? No matter how good you eat, you could still get very sick. No matter how many great smart books you read, you could still be very confused. And no matter how many great spiritual teachings you say you do or how much meditation you do, you could still get very depressed or sad or frustrated. It's not going to be a cure-all, but what we're seeking here is that alchemical transformation. And one thing to always keep in mind is that alchemy and transformation is very messy. It's not neat. Just like if anyone's seen a birth before, it's not a beautiful sight, right? Unless people it can be very psychotically damaging, right? And so same thing as if someone, for example, working on cadavers. I remember when I was in medicine and we would work on cadavers, and I had to work on some cadavers that had a lot of heart disease, right? And you literally see that you have to cut through more layers of fat. And then you see like, wow, that's what's going on. I didn't see what was happening inside, but now I see. So it kind of traumatically, in a good way, can traumatically change you. So we have to think about, we have to look at these ideas and say, am I having some kind of experience which is changing me? When you can kind of gauge that. What a gauge with that would be like, for example, spiritually, if you're studying, whether you're a Gnostic Christian, whether you're a Sufi, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're a Hindu, your spiritual practice should allow you to digest the world at a better pace. It doesn't mean that makes the world safer, more understandable, happier, none of that. It just means you can address it and deal with it in a better way. You're not totally losing your mind or freaking out all the time. It's a big thing. We see that with the rising rates of depression now. You can see it all the time. One of the most heartbreaking things for me as both a Gnostic bishop and as a medical practitioner is to have someone come in and say, I read all your articles, I've read all your books. Maybe they came to me that way. Maybe they don't even know that's happening. They just came to me because they heard about an article I wrote about medicine. They'll list all these amazing spiritual practices they're doing, but then they'll say, but I'm really suffering from depression, anxiety, sadness, all these other things. You can see nothing's connecting, right? Everything's kind of like set apart in their life in these little areas, and nothing's kind of connecting together. And there's no integration, we would say. And that's a very dangerous thing to happen. Our world right now is kind of set up to just break everything apart, disconnect everything. We can see that. Disconnection of families, disconnection of genders, disconnection. Everything's just being disconnected. People don't know what to do with it. So I think we need to seek things in our lives that reconnect us to everything. So your spiritual practice shouldn't be so distant that you think, oh, what does this have to do with my everyday life? It should have everything to do with your everyday life. Your physical health has everything to do with your daily life. Your psychological health has everything to do with every relationship you have in your life. And your spiritual practice should have the same thing as well do. Your spiritual practice should make you more passionate about life. Your spiritual practice should make you more inspired about life, regardless of what's going on in the news. In spite of all of that. And so that, if you don't see that happening, then you need to say, maybe I'm not doing what I need to be doing in my spiritual path. Maybe I'm not doing what I need to be doing in my psychological learning. Maybe I'm not doing what I need to be doing in my physical path. All those things tie together. And that's what we typically need to start doing. That's where the self-reflection comes in. People are always looking for, the biggest question I get is, how do I find a teacher? How do I find a teacher? How do I get initiated into these magical mystery things that you've been initiated into? And it usually has nothing to do with that. It has more to do with self-reflection, discipline, self-discipline, and self-reflection. And how does this relate to your everyday life? How is this going to make you a better person that you can contribute to your lodge, to your family, to your friends, to society locally? And that you can only do that as much as you're physically strong, psychologically at peace, and intelligent, and then spiritually balanced and integrated. So you can kind of gauge that. It's very easy to look. You can kind of go through that and say, am I digesting these things? For example, do I have a lot of medical health problems? Am I on the scale of what I could afford to lose some weight? Those should be goals for your family, for your life. I'd like to have more energy so I can do more events, right? I can go to more things. I'm not tired on the weekend. Psychologically, you could think, okay, am I reading more? Am I learning more? Am I spending more time in front of the TV than I'm in front of a book? That's a big thing now. For example, I have patients who could tell me 8 seasons of Game of Thrones. Crazy details. But they claim they can't read a book. But they could. They totally could. If it's just not a priority to them. It's not something that they want to do or have to do. And the same thing with the spiritual. You say, how much time am I spending on my spiritual life? And is this spiritual life truly inspiring every level of my life? In every part of it. And that's when we start to kind of branch over into what we would call the Gnostic experience. That's when someone goes to initiation and they're not the same person anymore. You're totally transformed. We see that a lot in yoga. People will say things like, I had a Kundalini Awakening this weekend at the workshop, and I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting, it was just amazing. They were playing this great music, and I felt it come over, and I'll say, okay, well, let's talk in a month and see how you're doing. Let's talk in 2 months and see how you're doing. And then usually in 1 month or 2 months, you're like, oh, I don't even remember what you were talking about, or I don't remember that happening. That wasn't a true experience. When we want experiences that are literally, when we have them, we're so alchemically transformed we can't go back to who we were before. And that's what life is about. That's what life is about. So same thing with physically too. We should have some kind of physical experience which is constantly changing us, learning which is constantly transforming us, and then a spiritual experience which is constantly allowing us to experience this alchemy of change. You might, if you've read any of my material, one of the topics I often say a lot is I speak about the virus of modernity. And I say that because we can't see viruses except under a microscope, or someone could say, "Do you have a virus?" And they'll be like, I'm not really sure, but most likely you do because of the following signs. So let's give you this. Viruses can be very disturbing because they can morph and change, and they can take over the body, use the body as its host, and live there, even be subclinical. It doesn't show up on blood work until certain times, and it shows up. That's kind of modernity is kind of doing that to us. It's tending to make us all fatter, weaker, less intelligent, more sad. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I can't get into all that in 40 minutes, but I can guarantee you, if you start to examine the field of your physical health, the field of your mental health, psychological health, education, the field of your spiritual practice, right there is enough to put a huge block into you feeling like you're just a robot in a machine. All of my occult work is based on that. My medical work's based on that. My occult work's based on that. Is how do our spiritual experiences make us be more passionate about our everyday life? And that's the key. And so to me, I can't think of anything more inspiring than a Masonic lodge to embody that structure. When I look at, I'm not a Mason. I'm a deeply esoteric, many lineages and many different things, but I've got so many friends in Masonic lodges, and I'm deeply studied in the Kabbalah. I thought I would go into a big, Kabbalistic exposition on this today to just scare everyone for 5 minutes and then jump back into it, because so many people are scared of the Kabbalah. But those things are so, Masonic lodges have so much potential for doing this. There's so much potential within Masonic lodges for helping each other grow physically stronger. Exercise groups, support groups with that. There's so much infrastructure ready for book and reading groups and transformation and what we're reading and discussing that. And then, of course, there's so much room for a deep spiritual experience to provide authentic initiations, not counter initiations. So that's one thing I thought was very inspired to speak to this audience for that. But that's kind of the essential ideas that I kind of wanted to come in this. It's about 45 minutes of my talk. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions if we have on this, and if anything I've confused anyone. So please, let's take some questions now. Yes, sir.